of.
Okay. Now I'm here with Instormant, talking to John McCALLISTER, MLA, independent MLA. Thank you very much, John, for seeing me. I know you're a busy man.
Pleasure, Jude.
So we'll try to keep this as brief as we can. Could we start first of all with the recent agreement? There seems to be three headings we could talk about this under. One is the question of money. Second is the question of paramilitaries. And the third is the question of legacy issues. Let's talk about the money first of all. The figure that's been bandied about is something like over 500 million. Is that the way you see it?
The figures throughout this year have been very, very difficult. Because first, when welfare first collapsed, we were going to run out of money in July, and indeed, could we even do a budget? So we did the budget, and it was passed. Then the next thing was going to be the end of October. And then we sort of got for a while when the paramilitary involvement came into the issue in late summer. It was almost as if everybody forgot about the money, and nobody mentioned, by the way, we're going to run out of money here. So the paramilitary stuff was much more important. I mean, things I've been critical of in the past from Stormont 1 was things like, because we didn't make decisions around voluntary exit scheme, we've had to borrow 700 million to do that. Had we put a recruitment freeze on earlier, we could have avoided that. 700 million, all right, there's a quick payback, but it's an enormous amount of money to borrow to make people redundant or retire. So the money seems closer to the mark. The 500 million does seem. There's a certain amount of smoke and mirrors with one by June 2015, even though we're now past June.
But is there the extra money? Is there actually 500 million?
Of extra in the original Storm?
No, in the new one.
I don't think it's as much as 500 million.
So you're saying they would have got more if they went with the original?
Well, our problem is with not going with the original agreement was that welfare was to be completed by sort of March, April time. It was finally rejected by late May. Well, we were ratcheting up, 114 million of extra debt. And don't forget, we'd already been in a place that we'd had to borrow 100 million to get us out of a problem last year. So we were into already, that was 214 million that you had to repay this year or next year. And not doing well for you again, got into a place that next year or the year after was going to be 196 million. So whether we have any new money or significant amounts of new money, I don't think there's as much as 500.
So there's some, but not as much.
There's some, but there's not as much. Then there's some from promises from the Irish government as well.
For the A5. Yeah. How much are they promising, by the way? Do you know? It's
somewhere about a total of 150 million.
They said they were going to pay earlier, then they pulled out, and now they're back in again.
They're back in again at a much you'd be surprised at that in politics, wouldn't you? at a much reduced rate. The original promise was something like 600 million euro, and you're now talking, I think they've already spent about 50 million, and then there's several tranches of 25 million over the 4 years. But basically they've got a better deal by doing the hokey cokey, because they're probably spending about, I think it is now in pounds, this one, but it still would be less than half of what was originally promised, probably. Maybe 40% of what was originally promised.
Okay. In a nutshell, would you say that financially we've come out looking better at the end of the negotiations than we did at the beginning of the negotiations, or worse, or the same?
I think much the same. I think you could maybe say, if you were looking at in straight pounds, are we better off? We would be slightly better off. If you're looking overall, the damage is done to our reputation, as in the stability of this place, having it has talks in 2013, Stormont 1 in 2014, and Stormont 2, or Stormont revisited, reheated, rebooted by 2015. The damage that, and that's very, very hard to quantify, the damage that has done to us, the image of stability around the world. You know, don't forget, in economic terms, stability, and First Minister confirmed this in an answer to me today, stability is your number one. You know, when people look about inward investment, stability is your number one, followed by corporation tax and other issues, skills of workforce, other issues. But politically, stability is key, and the damage that has done is a very hard figure to quantify. So, have we helped ourselves by having another almost a full year of delay in implementing Stormont House? No, I think it's been negative overall, but look, we are where we are in that regard.
Okay, so let's talk a bit about the whole question of paramilitaries. What's been agreed for a start regarding paramilitaries?
I mean, paramilitaries, all right, wasn't, you know, it's been there hanging about, and it's been brought to the fore with the issues that have come up over the summer and up to it. But I mean, looking at what's been agreed, it's very much agreed that they'll go and look about how we end paramilitarism and criminality and all of the issues that are associated with it. But how we measure that at the end of it is very, very difficult. And you know, through this process, you had people getting the very high moral ground about the IRA Army Council being there, and then the next thing you read in the paper, well, actually loyalist paramilitaries, they haven't gone away, you know, either. So, I mean, effectively agreeing that they would bring some sort of strategy to try and take the need for paramilitaries out. But again, that's going to be very hard to measure, going to be very hard to deliver, and indeed what happens. And it's one of the things that I keep saying about Northern Ireland politics. We tend to operate in a place that there's no real consequences for when you don't meet a target, you know, or you don't deliver on something.
But is there not some penalty attached to? I'm not sure what it's attached to, but something to do with paramilitaries. There is
around some of the government funding, and that you.
No, I thought it was something about ejection, or you know.
Yes, but it's very.
It's linked up with paramilitaries. You can
very,
throw that.
Very modest, but who's going to actually do that? I don't think it's not particularly robust, because I don't think Sinn Féin would ever sign up to something that was terribly robust. The paramilitary stuff, as I read it, was a wee bit of, look, we've had a few problems here with the Chief Constable and the report coming out and saying the IRA Army Council still exists. What's the least worst we can do? How do we try and bring in unionist side, how do we try and bring in some of the fringe loyalist paramilitaries that have always had this awkward relationship with mainstream unionism, if you like? How do they bring some of that in? How do they tackle some of the criminality? How do they get some of these people? And I think the important bit is, how do you take in some of those communities that suffer most from paramilitary criminality activity, how do you take effectively the boot of paramilitaries out of some of those communities? That, I think, would be welcome if that's achievable, but it's very, very limited, Jude. Very limited stuff.
Well, just to talk briefly about loyalist paramilitaries, first of all, they have been obviously around for a long time, like for at least a decade, right, after the Good Friday Agreement.
Yes.
So why was there not a fuss about them before the killing of Kevin McGuigan and Jock Davison?
Well, I mean, from
why were unionist politicians not up and saying, we don't want this?
Well, I can give you the answer on that, because I would hold a slightly different view personally. The answer was that they weren't in government, and they just were, whereas Sinn Féin and the IRA were saying the Sinn Féin were in government. Now, that's not a viewpoint that I actually subscribe to. It was just a convenience thing to ignore them. And look, there's been no doubt, and as people have pointed out over IMC reports, that there was, right throughout them, there was evidence that the Army Council existed in some form. And as I've often said to people, well, if you wanted to speak to the IRA Army Council, you could go into the basement restaurant here in this building if you wanted to do that. But the difference...
Do you believe the Army Council actually exists? always has existed?
I believe
Since the Good Friday Agreement?
I believe it has existed in some form.
Since the Good Friday Agreement?
Yes.
Really?
I believe it existed.
That they meet
in some
regularly
form.
and...
Well, in some form, to do as George Hamilton, the Chief Constable, would say, are they doing politics? Are they committed to peace? Absolutely. And you might also say, has it been a benefit to keep people and to stop maybe people straying off to dissidence, or indeed to keep some level of control on an organisation? Has that been good or bad? I mean, probably need to ask somebody on the inside, but...
It's funny, sort of an army council that's only in politics.
Well, again, we haven't created, as a society or as an assembly, we maybe haven't created the space to draw out, not only on the IRA Army Council, but in loyalist paramilitaries and communities there that feel they've got no benefit from the Good Friday Agreement. And that's been the Good Friday Agreement's maybe delivered very nicely for the middle classes, but what has it done in inner East Belfast or in the Shankill or the Falls? And that's been the problem. That's where you would really have to start and tackle, education underachievement, and I suppose sometimes the intimidation that those types of paramilitaries put on communities in which they're involved in.
Do you believe in 5 years' time, John, that the paramilitaries, as you've described them, criminality, and as you say, the boot on the communities that they're in, do you think that will not be a problem?
I think
5 years' time
I
from now?
think it'll take longer than 5 years.
10
and
years?
I think it'll take more to move on things like getting away from criminality that some people are hooked on.
How do you do that, though?
I think it's probably will shift from much more like what you would see in other large cities around the UK or Ireland of almost a gang culture and people involved in making money. And when people are making money, whether it's on drugs or trafficking people or whatever, there will always be need and always been need to be a determined police and National Crime Agency effort to combat that. And that's a sign that we would be no different in that regard from Manchester or Dublin or Limerick.
But when if you take, say, Limerick, and the drug trafficking goes on there, or has gone on there, you don't have representatives of the gangs making public pronouncements.
And I think that's where you have to, and that's where the Stormont House, the Fresh Start, has to really tackle that. You separate out those, you move away from this, that this is, if you're in politics and doing politics, it is about politics, and all that other stuff has to be tackled head on by the police.
Do you think they're not tackling it head on? Do you think they're going too softly at the moment?
I don't think, to be fair, that you could say the police or the NCA are going that softly. I haven't seen any evidence to say, they've turned a blind eye or ignored it. And a lot of people, when this first blew up about the IRA Army Council, most people were expecting, Chief Constable and other people to put out a report that sort of glossed over it, and they didn't do that. To be fair,
You see, I get about, we don't want to get stuck in this because I want to move on to the other things. But I understood that the people who said the IRA Army Council was this overarching body were some members of the IRA who said they thought that was the case.
Yes.
Not the Chief Constable, he was reporting what they said.
Yes, the Chief Constable.
So we're going on the word of a couple of IRA men that the Army Council exists, and is that exerting this power?
But Jude, that's always been the crazy place where we ended up getting to, that we were almost waiting. As I said, unionism at some point, it hooked itself on that place that we need a statement from Jerry Adams, which you wouldn't believe anyway when it came, so why are you waiting on it? And that's all you're ever going to be able to hook a lot of this on, is intelligence and what you know from various sources, and it's always going to be set in that context. This is our understanding, this is our best guess. As you know, not every intelligence we've ever got has been accurate.
Sometimes intentionally and sometimes not intentionally.
Yes, because it could be harmful but certainly it gave the impression that the Chief Constable was been pretty open that this is what our understanding is.
Okay, let's move on to the question of legacy issues which weren't dealt with Were you very disappointed with that? And do you see any prospect of that problem being cracked?
I didn't particularly like what was in the Stormont House agreement. I mean, it's not universally popular, but my own view on legacy issues is quite distinct in that I'm much more in agreement with what the Attorney General John Larkin said, that there should be no inquiries, no investigations into the past or pre-1998 offences, and that you could then look about how you keep an archive or start people writing and looking at it, but in the understanding we're not investigating any of these issues. You free up as well a fairly significant amount of money over a 5-year period. We were set to spend like 190 million, and at the minute doing very little to bring any closure or justice or sense of end game for anyone. And that's why, so setting it in that context, so was I disappointed that they couldn't get legacy issues over the line on this? Probably disappointed, but not terribly surprised, because we seem to be always trying to move to a point that we want to agree what a definition of a victim is, and we can't. You know, we're not going to agree. The big parties, DUP and Sinn Féin, are not going to agree. You know, Sinn Féin are not going to agree to the definition that I would sign up to, and vice versa. And on even the narrative of what went on here in the last 40 plus years, we're not going to agree that. So we've no way of getting agreement on that. And you look even at simple things like this idea about providing some victims with a pension. Suddenly you're down to a number of people that one side thinks are unsuitable or don't qualify, and you're on to the other side saying no, they have to. So we end up, nobody gets anything, and that's what has been so frustrating with the legacy issues.
Isn't it, would the core problem of legacy issues not be that not everybody who was involved in violence is going to come out and say it? And that includes state forces particularly. In fact, if anything, you could argue, or could you argue, that the British government and its agents would be the biggest blockage in terms of people coming clean?
But I'm not sure there's actually evidence to back that up if you look at what they've done, particularly in Bloody Sunday.
Well, my reason I say it about Bloody Sunday was Bloody Sunday went on forever and it cost millions and millions and millions. And there are people who say that's because the British government would not come clean with what documents they had and what in fact happened. But
the other point in that, the British government eventually had to come clean, and you had a British Prime Minister apologising in the House of Commons, watched live from Londonderry on it. You're unlikely to see the same level of scrutiny on the IRA, the INLA, the UVF, the UDA, and you're unlikely to see them producing documents that says we did this. So while I absolutely accept that the state has a duty to protect all its citizens, and the standard, quite rightly, for the state should be set even higher, the difficulty you get into is the state and how you make others. The state shouldn't be the only one to be made amenable. Others, how do you make the IRA, the UVF come clean on any of this?
Maybe the state should set the example in a way, because as you say, the state should be held to higher standards than illegal paramilitary organisations.
Well, I know definitely with the state being held to a higher example, but the state is unlikely to start to do that unilaterally on its own, or the two states, even if you add in the Irish.
But do you not think that either state, particularly the British, simply won't tell you? I mean, even we talk about Bloody Sunday, there's a lot of people who believe that the trail of Bloody Sunday goes an awful lot higher than where it stopped in the Savile Inquiry report.
But there's always going to be people who are never... This is always the thing about dealing with the past, is when do you bring or get any sense of justice or closure? And even that my understanding of the families in Bloody Sunday, there's some people who feel they've had their sense of closure. There's some people who probably think it maybe went on up the higher maybe all the way to number 10. And there's some people who actually want to see prosecutions, as we'd a soldier been questioned last week or the week before last. So you've different people wanting different things and expecting different things. And the warning that I do say to all those who class themselves as victims is we probably can't achieve getting closure for everyone. That you cannot get, not everybody, the 3,500, 3,600 people that lost their lives and their families, they're not all going to get a sense of justice. They're not all going to get their day in court. They're not all going to get that sense of closure. And that's a huge regret. But you cannot get all the players that were involved to come clean. And no matter how clean any group of players think they are, there'll always be somebody who will throw that bit about, well, I don't believe you. Or the line you've just used in Bloody Sunday. No, this goes further than Savile.
What would you do, very, very briefly now, what do you think should be done?
In the past,
yes.
The Attorney General's line.
Essentially an amnesty from 1988.
Well, it's not, and John Larkin was very clear that this isn't an amnesty. It is saying there will be no investigations, no prosecutions, and then we're just not going to look into anything before the 10th of April 1998.
Sounds like an amnesty.
And it's not the difference in an amnesty. An amnesty would be saying that everybody's free to go. This would be saying we're just not going to investigate, not going to look at it and do it that way. And I think that, and it's not like, bear in mind you, that's not an easy message for me going out and telling some of my constituents who feel very frustrated that they've had no sense of closure or justice, and actually been brutally honest with them and said, I don't think you're going to get any, and it'd be wrong in me to promise any victim that you could get closure or justice. And that's why I think that view is one I've long held over a number of years, even before John Larkin said it, when I'd heard other people talking about it, like the Reverend John Dunlop, saying that we've no way of fixing this, and then on the other side of that, looking at how we would compile an archive and encourage people to come forward and tell their stories and their experiences of the Troubles, and how we do that, and how we maybe open up some of the public records to look and to deal with that, but knowing that no former IRA people, no former British soldiers, no former police officers, no former UVF people are going to face prosecution or investigation. And I don't class myself as a victim. I didn't suffer directly in the Troubles, nor was I ever a perpetrator. So nobody's going to come knocking on my door to ask what I was doing in 1989 or 1991 or whatever. So I don't have a vested interest, and I know it's difficult to go and say, but at the minute we are spending 190 or 200 million pounds over 5 years. We have coroner's courts been brought into it, and all of the apparatus we've used in the past. We nearly wrecked the policing ombudsman's office dealing with the past, and we're not delivering any of the real needs of what those that suffered the most are in 2015. And I'm just making the argument that what you could do with those types of resources on mental health issues, on financial support, you could change the outcome and the outlook for victims and make those that have suffered the most you could lessen the financial difficulties. You may not lessen the pain, and you will not lessen the pain, but you could change the circumstances with which you deal with victims.
Okay. It's a very tangled whole issue indeed. Can we move to the question of your bill? You had a bill recently. Did that go forward to the Assembly? It
went forward in second reading, and it's now with the committee. And basically, it's a technical problem there, Jude.
We're going to solve that in no time at all.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's second reading, and it's now with the committee, the Assembly and Executive Review Committee. Now, in light of the Stormont House Fresh Start agreement, now I do welcome, and I do feel I can take some credit for having shifted the debate on opposition. There's some more stuff in that from what was in Stormont House 1 to the Fresh Start document.
In essence, what's in it? Are you looking for an opposition?
In essence, what's in my bill, or what's
in your bill?
In essence, what's in my bill, if I split it into two, it would reform the way the executive works and bring in collective cabinet responsibility. It would mean you have to agree a programme for government and sign up for it, and it would bring in the Assembly an opposition. You could form an opposition by any of the main parties. It would allow for technical groups in the Assembly. It would remove community designation. It would change petitions of concern. It would move to a weighted majority vote.
Is this voluntary coalitions that you're talking about?
So no, it's not. It's not. It's like a hybrid between consociational government. We would still stick with the hunt, but I would have to say now, in light of the Fresh Start agreement, I'm looking at how, one, I reflect in the bill any agreements made on Fresh Start, and two, what we do with the changes to the executive, because that's I'm currently now trying to meet with parties and see where are we in some of the issues that the Fresh Start agreement has brought out. Agreeing a programme for government. They've set themselves 2 weeks. I want to make it 4. Around collective responsibility and what I can do and realistically move and get support for through the Assembly. So we're into that sort of process of negotiations between parties and what we can support and what we might have to drop.
But you're looking for people collective responsibility. I thought we had that already. Like, surely people who are in an executive, they're all jointly responsible for what the executive does, no?
Oh, Jude, no. I think you've been travelling over the border into the south for too many years. In the south, they have collective responsibility enshrined in their constitution. But here, that's why we can have one minister suing another minister, one minister protesting against another minister.
So in your bill, that would not happen.
But I would acknowledge now I'm going to struggle to get the support from the big parties, particularly to get that through. But what I wanted is to shift the debate on and to say, here is what we can do. Here is a chance to use this bill to say, what's in the Stormont House agreement? What can you live with? What do we need to make a credible opposition within the Assembly? These are changes in the executive, I think, in the longer term, will need to happen.
Why do you think people fear opposition and government? As in most countries.
At the minute we have a government and opposition, but they are all the one people. So that's why it looks so dysfunctional.
But why do you think they fear?
They fear the change, or they fear a phrase that you used, is this going to voluntary coalition? But it's not, because we're sticking to the hunt. And a lot of the smaller parties fear being left in opposition, that even if they're not that fit for government, they don't think they're fit for opposition. And that's why parties find it difficult to do. And they all then want to exercise their right to take up a ministry, even if they've no policy agenda to bring to that department.
You don't think it's an echo from back for the first 50 years of the state, when you had an opposition which was totally neutered from the very beginning?
Well, it is, but you couldn't. The things that are very different from 1972 is that everyone's agreed to power sharing. Now, the difference that I would be suggesting is that we don't actually have power sharing. We've shared out power. So how do we move to genuine power sharing? When you move to that, you move to an agreed programme for government, you move to collective, and you take collective responsibility, because you actually take some of the fear people have out of the elections, or out of who gets what ministry, because you've agreed what the agenda is going to be. So suddenly Sinn Féin be in the economy or in education or somewhere else, you remove that fear. I think in the nationalist side there is some, particularly to people that are of an age that they remember that time. But I would say as an independent unionist, they changed the electoral system in 1929 as much to stop independent unions as to stop anybody else, and to keep everyone together at that point. You also count our electoral system is exactly the same as the Republic of Ireland. It would be very hard for any, you need like a seismic shift in voting patterns for any of our traditional community blocks to dominate in that way. So you have safeguards not only in the electoral system that we use here, we have safeguards that I want to stick with the hunt, so that's your ticket in to be in government. And so how do you create space that people and parties actually see there is a benefit to being in opposition and not being responsible for budget cuts, or until you've actually all the levers of power or a significant proportion of the levers, and how do you present an alternative to that? And I think for the smaller parties, the Ulster Unionists, the SDLP and Alliance, they should be seriously thinking about going in to an opposition and creating that alternative as you move through the next assembly.
Do you think your bill will get through?
If I was a betting man, I wouldn't overdo it. I think we might get some bits through. I think we'll probably lose some of the bits around the executive and the collective responsibility, I think, and removing community designation.
Will there be an opposition?
As bridge too far. I think there will be an opposition in some form, yes.
And
I'm determined to provide it.
When do you expect? Well, there's Jim McCALLISTER too.
Yes, well, I'm happy to let Jim help out.
When do you expect your bill to be through the Assembly?
Well, the Assembly, the committee stage, the committee have up to the end of January to do it, and they produce a report. So after that committee stage, it would come back to the Assembly with whatever amendments and whatever changes. Now, I'm working at the minute on amendments to try and reflect the agreements made in a fresh start, and look at the bits that I probably know I'm going to have to tone down, shall we say. So I'm looking to, and that's why I'm meeting with as many parties as possible to say, right, here's, and find out where everybody is, what you can live with, what you need changed, all of that. And then come back in early February, consideration stage, further consideration stage, and final stage. And if we get to then if we're getting anywhere near final stage, I'll tell you to put money on at that point.
But you expect it before the election?
Yes, yes.
Is this
well, if it's not made, literally all legislation that's made, that's in process at the time of the election, falls when the Assembly's dissolved.
What?
So it's either do it before the election or it's gone.
And you had another little item in it that there'd be two first ministers rather than a first minister and a deputy first minister.
I've always just thought that more accurately reflects. You know, if I come round to your door and think you're a wavering Sinn Féin voter, I tell you, well, look, wouldn't Marty getting first minister wouldn't really put it up to the unionists? And if I think you're a wavering...
Every door thought it was a union.